So it appears that Ted Cruz and Trevor Noah got into a spat. I'm surprised Ted Cruz is still a sitting senator right now. But they ended up getting into a little feud on Twitter because basically, with the new census numbers, Texas gained some seats. They gained at least one seat because they're having a huge population explosion, largely because a lot of Californians are leaving and going to other neighboring states. And so a lot of them are going to Texas, a lot of liberal areas in Texas. Um, and so they're getting a lot of people. New York lost a House seat because they were actually short 89 people in the census counting. So that's pretty huge. And so, Trevor Noah was shocked. He said, "This is unbelievable. You're telling me that if just 89 more New Yorkers had filled out their census, the state wouldn't have lost a House seat?" Aside from New York getting screwed, the big news out of the census is that America's population grew at the slowest rate since the 1930s. Basically, immigration is down and the birth rate is falling, primarily due to this photo, he said before showing an image of Cruz wearing a baseball cap. That's pretty funny. Noah added that 1930 sucked for America due in part to events like the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. Just keep in mind that without immigration, it's pretty hard for modern rich nations to really grow in population, because once you become a modern rich nation, people just don't really want to have kids anymore. And so there's actually a crisis in a lot of major countries where the birth rates are just, they're non-existent. And so with the way Social Security and social benefits are set up, you need like a certain amount of people who can fund throughout the time before they can qualify for Social Security, for example. You need like a certain amount of young people who are funding Social Security for every single person who's actually receiving Social Security. But now that the birth rates are going down, they're going to have to change the numbers because there just aren't enough people who are supporting the old people who are getting Social Security. And so it's like, it's getting into the threatening zone of potential insolvency down the line. But what's really interesting here is, it says Cruz responded to the segment in a Wednesday morning tweet. He says Trevor Noah whines that people are fleeing high tax blue states and moving in droves to low tax states like Texas, where the jobs are. Doesn't understand why people like freedom. Also predicts the Biden years will be the Great Depression. So here's something interesting, and this is something that Texans are fearing a lot, and they should. If I were a right-wing Texan, I would be going to sleep anxiety-ridden. I wouldn't be able to get any sleep, because what's happening right now is a bunch of blue Democrats are flooding your state. They're all going there. So California's facing like an exodus right now because there's so many fucking people in California. And so that means a bunch of liberals are going to Austin, Dallas, all these areas in Texas. And so what's going to end up happening is Texas is going to become the next California. It's going to become blue. And if Biden wasn't a candidate who was so garbage with Hispanic voters hated Joe Biden. It's the main reason why he totally flopped in Florida. But he did really poorly with Hispanic voters. If there was a better candidate who was more appealing to Hispanic voters, Texas would have been a lot closer this time around. And so, as this flood keeps happening, Texas is going to be taken over, is what's going to happen. There's a bunch of Bernie Sanders supporters and liberals moving over to Texas right now. So that's not something I would brag about if I were Ted Cruz. That's really going to bite you in the ass, because all of a sudden you're going to look around and be like, wait a second, we're a blue state. So they gained this House seat, but really that's just a House seat that in the next 4 to 8 years will be held by a Democrat. And so Trevor Noah has a little zinger. He says, not sure I'd be using the words fleeing and Texas in the same sentence. Senator Cancun. I think that's also a very good roast right there, because it is important. Don't let Ted Cruz forget. This guy, okay, his house was freezing. They were out of power. And then they went on a trip to Cancun and made up some bullshit story about some trip that her daughter had pre-planned, and he didn't want to be a bad father. That was all made up. It got totally exposed and debunked. Do not let Ted Cruz or anybody forget about that, because that's such a massive scandal and such an embarrassing thing. So really good zinger from Trevor Noah there. And Ted Cruz says, I wear your scorn with pride. I remember when The Daily Show was funny. The Daily Show has definitely declined quite a bit, for sure. I mean, no one can fill the shoes of Jon Stewart. My distaste for Trevor Noah is I don't feel like he challenges power enough. the way that Jon Stewart did. I feel like Trevor Noah's more of just a down the line Democrat type of guy, especially with 2016 election. But Jon Stewart was Jon Stewart, right? Like, that's what made him unique. He would call out Republicans and Democrats. He would be really harsh towards both parties. That's why people like Jon Stewart, was because he wasn't some partisan hack. He may have been left wing, but he was more than willing to call out Democrats all the time. He still thinks that Obama didn't do nearly enough. So that's why people like Jon Stewart. He wasn't afraid to call out power. Trevor Noah is too afraid to do that, and he just doesn't have the same charisma in this field that Jon Stewart did. So it's definitely gone down a lot in quality. I mean, it's hard to fill the shoes of Jon Stewart for sure. But yeah, so that's the back and forth that went on between Ted Cruz and Trevor Noah. Ted Cruz once again getting laughed at, and Texas, Republican Texans, be afraid, man. You're in trouble.